General Ames is, oh, I don't remember what it was. We had a question about, is there any Civil War monuments in Tewksbury? And we got, gee whiz, maybe in the, some of the local graveyards there's some people recognize, but there's nothing really in Tewksbury like some other towns that recognizes the Civil War and what Tewksbury, what role they played in it. And this is a very important character as far as the Civil War goes, and he came and lived in Tewksbury. So with that, I'd like to introduce Keith Rauseo, newly elected school committee member. Congratulations. And I'm going to let him do a show.
Please let me know right away if I'm not loud enough. Everybody tells you to start off a presentation with a joke. I don't have a joke, but I have a request that will probably be funny. There's a lot of people in this room that probably know more about Tewksbury-centric history than I do. And there's a chance that as I get into the end of this presentation, when I start talking about General Ames in Tewksbury, I may say something that's wrong. My request is that please don't jump right up and tell me that I'm wrong. Wait until the end when we do the Q&A, because you'll throw me all off.
Nobody in this crowd will be jumping up to about
General Adelbert Ames. Adelbert Ames was born on Halloween, October 31st, 1835, in Rockland, Maine. He was born during the second term of President Andrew Jackson. He was the son of Captain Jesse Ames, a clipper ship captain on the Maine coast, and Martha Tolman Ames. He had an older brother, John T. Ames, and ancestors of the Ames family were purported to come over on the Mayflower. The earliest known record of them is in Charlestown, Massachusetts, as early as 1634. Young Adelbert traveled with his father all over the world in his teenage years as a seaman on his father's clipper ships. But he decided that a sailor's life was not for him, but a soldier's life was. So after spending most of his teenage years on ship with his father and becoming very much accomplished in mathematics and art and watercolors, all self-taught, he decided to get into a more formal education, and his parents sent him to private schools in both Farmington and Bucksport, Maine. The schooling and the environment in Maine was very much an abolitionist society, very much anti-slavery, and he learned to have a very much ingrained hatred of that institution from his very youth. After private school, he entered West Point in 1857 because he had spent so much time of his youth being self-taught and working on the clipper ships. He was somewhat older than the rest of his class. He entered the class when he was 22 years old. And he graduated in June of 1861, ranked 5th in his class of 34th. General George Custer also graduated in that same class. He was 34th out of 34. Because in June of 1861, the Civil War basically had begun at Fort Sumter in April of that year. Lieutenant Ames at that time was immediately put into the service and assigned to Battery D of the 5th U.S. Artillery as a battery lieutenant. At the first battle at Bull Run on July 21st, 1861, he was severely wounded in the thigh, but he stayed with his guns. His troops actually put him up on a caisson and laid him there so he could continue to issue orders to the guns, to the men. And he stayed there until he lost so much blood that they had to remove him from the field. After the battle, he was given the brevet rank, which is an honorary rank that happened a lot during the Civil War, of Major in the U.S. Army. And in 1894, he received the Medal of Honor for his service at the First Battle of Bull Run. After a few weeks' recovery, he returned to the service, first with the troops charged with the defense of Washington from September of 1861 through March of 1862. second in command, the gentleman off to the right, was Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was the former Bowden Professor, future Governor of Maine, who you may know if you've read the book The Killer Angels or seen the movie Gettysburg, and we'll talk about him later and what the 20th Maine did in that battle. Ames was because he just came out of West Point, he was very much a student of discipline, and he believed that discipline was the way, especially with frontiersmen and rough volunteers like were in the 20th Maine. And he drilled the men very hard. And some of the quotes from one soldier in his letters home to his family were, "Colonel Ames will take the men out to drill and will drill them uphill and down. I tell you, he's about as savage a man as you ever saw, and I swear they will shoot him in the first battle we are in." But his aide-de-camp, in other letters home, said Ames never asked men to go where he wouldn't go himself, and under the hottest fire, he quietly gave his orders, often in the form of a request. So I think he knew both how to handle his officers in the regiment and his men. And as they showed later, the 20th Maine really took that discipline to heart. At the Battle of Fredericksburg on the 12th of December, 1862, his was one of the many regiments that were thrown at an unbreakable Confederate line in Marye's Heights. The only commander to lead his regiment personally into battle and to have all of his men behind him when they went into that hell of fire was Adelbert Ames. And he lost 36 of his men in that fight, but they were all struck behind him. In fact, he said to his parents in a letter, "Up until this battle, I've been somewhat disliked by my men and officers, but at that battle the feelings of the regiment changed somewhat. I was the only colonel in the brigade who went in front of his regiment and led his men into the fight. All of my men who were killed or wounded were in rear of me when struck. My men now have confidence in me, and the battle taught them the necessity of discipline." At the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was a disaster for the Union, from May 2nd to 4th, 1863, he served as the aide-de-camp to General Joseph Hooker, who at that time was in command of the entire Army of the Potomac. On the 20th of May, 1863, after Chancellorsville, upon the recommendation of both General Hooker and General Oliver Howard, Ames was made a brigadier general of volunteers, and the command of the 20th Maine fell to Colonel Chamberlain. Ames at this time was considered one of the boy generals, the young men who had graduated from West Point in the late 1850s and early 1860s, who rose to general rank very quickly because of their service in the Civil War. This is Brigadier General Ames, as we're moving along here. At the Battle of Brandy Station, Virginia, on the 9th of June, 1863, Ames commanded troops that supported the cavalry of General Alfred Pleasonton. And Pleasonton, after the battle, wrote, "The marked manner in which General Ames held and managed his troops under a galling fire of the enemy for several hours is entitled to higher commendation than I can bestow." At the Battle of Gettysburg, obviously the most famous battle of the Civil War, 1st of July through the 3rd of July in 1863, Ames started the battle as the commander of the 2nd Brigade, 1st Division of the 11th Corps. He took over as the division commander on the 1st of July after then Division Commander Francis Barlow was wounded and taken prisoner during heavy fighting. I don't know, I hope you can see this. Ames had a huge part in the Battle of Gettysburg on two places, one where he was and one where he used to be. This is Cemetery Hill. This is the second day of the battle, the pivotal day. This is high ground at this end of the Union line coming down here, this fishhook of a line. And in the early afternoon and late in the evening of July 2nd, the Confederates threw an attack of 7,500 men at Ames's division of 1,200. And he held off for about 4 hours before these brigades came over and backed him up and drove the Confederates down the hill. If the Confederates had broken through, they would have held high ground behind the Union lines and would have been able to direct artillery at both sides, which would have set up, there probably wouldn't have been a Pickett's charge in that case because it wouldn't have been necessary. The more famous July 2nd, the Confederates came and attacked that left flank with incredible strength. And the 20th Maine held them back. They ran out of ammunition, and at that point, actually, Colonel Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge down the hill. His men had no ammunition to fight with, so he decided that instead of letting the Confederates come around the back of the line, it was better to just charge. And the Confederates actually did not know how to respond, and they surrendered by the hundreds to the 20th Maine, who had no weapon. They were guarding them after the battle with weapons that had no bullets. So obviously all the discipline that Ames had taught that regiment in the early part of 1862 paid off as they held back an incredible charge from the Confederacy. In a letter to his parents in August 1863, after the battle, Ames told about riding on the field of battle after Gettysburg, and he said, "Passing some troops, I found soon that cheering and swinging hats in the air were being given for one of us. I found out it was the 20th Maine, and they gave me 3 times 3, which is like a hip hip hooray type of cheer. And they will do anything for me." And in fact, they really did. They gave him, after the battle, their regimental flag that they held at Little Round Top. And for a Civil War regiment, the battle flag was the most important possession that they had. The Union government actually gave medals of honor to soldiers just for capturing the battle flag of a Confederate regiment. So that was an incredible gift for them to give him in recognition of the training that he had given them. Over the rest of 1863 and 1864, Ames held various commands all over the South, in Florida, South Carolina, and Virginia. He led troops in the Battle of Cold Harbor, Virginia on the 31st of May, 1864, and in the Siege of Petersburg, Virginia in the summer and fall of that year. At that time, with the war being very much drawn out into its 4th year, many of the soldiers in the Union Army became somewhat disillusioned with the war, as soldiers will do after that long of a time. And, there were defeats, they were slow-moving. General McClellan, who had been a favorite of the soldiers of the Union Army, actually ran for president in 1864 as the Democratic candidate against President Lincoln. And many of the soldiers had mixed feelings about the president at that time. This is kind of a long paragraph, but I think it's important to understand where Ames's head was at this time. In a letter to his father at the end of July, he wrote, "Lincoln is not a fit person for the head of this nation in its hour of trouble and grief. He evidently has not the nerve or the brain needed by one in his high and responsible station. We here think Mr. Lincoln has prostituted his authority and responsibility to the vile purpose of self-aggrandizement, his re-election. And in doing so, the military status of the country has fearfully suffered. This last I know. Unless the people sustain and reinforce us, we shall not meet with success. I cannot tell you how depressed and sad I feel in my belief that the northern people are to show themselves unworthy of the liberty won them by their fathers." After this, in late 1864, Ames had an active part in taking the port of Fort Fisher, North Carolina, which was the last open port of the Confederacy at that time. He was the commander of the 2nd Division in the 14th Corps at this time. Initial attacks in late December failed, but later attacks in January succeeded in taking the fort, and Ames's 3,000 men captured 2,000 Confederate soldiers and 72 cannon while losing 650 men killed and wounded. After the Battle of Fort Fisher in early 1865, Ames was breveted to Major General of Volunteers and to Colonel in the regular army, backdated to the 1st of July, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg. He commanded a division in the 10th Corps in North Carolina until the end of the war, and then after the war served in the District of South Carolina until the end of April 1866, when he was mustered out of the volunteer service and went back into the regular army. To his parents at this time, he wrote, "I am still at my duties, which consist in little more than adding the agents of the August 1867, he reported back for duty in Mississippi, and in July of 1868, he was appointed provisional governor of that state. In March of 1869, President Grant appointed Ames commander of the 4th Military District, which included the states of both Mississippi and Arkansas. As the Reconstruction Act had been passed, which provided for and called for voting rights for all, he supported it and he fought for it. He was a student of law, he was a student of honor and duty, and once there was a law on the books, he tended to put aside personal feelings and do what he could as his job demanded to support that law. He actually became a champion of the former slaves in Mississippi after seeing the awful treatment that they were experiencing. He removed hundreds of officials who condoned this mistreatment, and he used troops to protect people whenever possible. After Mississippi returned to the Union in early 1970, the reconstructed state legislature, which was mostly black Republicans, chose Ames to be one of Mississippi's United States senators on the 18th of March, 1870. Ames resigned from the Army at that point to accept this position, and at that point he was deemed a carpetbagger. And a carpetbagger was a term that the South used for people that they thought came from the North to run the South after the Civil War. And the term comes from that they considered them to be itinerant people that they could carry all their possessions in a carpet bag, which was like a small suitcase covered in carpet for its protection. And, so that they could move quickly from place to place. And, one book that I read, there was a chapter on General Ames, and it was titled The Carpetbagger of Conscience. And I think we'll see that in the end, that is what he was. The biggest problem he had as a new U.S. Senator was that as the provisional governor, he had signed his own credentials for his appointment to the Senate. Because at this time, this was the state legislators appointed U.S. senators, they weren't elected. And he was not a resident of Mississippi at the time. He was simply a soldier that was there commanding troops. And there were some Democrats and some Republicans who protested his Senate appointment. But he was finally admitted to the Senate after a good long debate of about several weeks, when he assured the Senate that he would find a residence in the state of Mississippi. But while all this was going on, he had found somebody that sort of took his mind off the issue of politics. I think that wasn't him. Hold on. That's the Senate. I forgot to say. And that would be Blanche Butler. Blanche Butler was the daughter of Benjamin Butler, who had been a general in the Civil War, who the South had known and called the Beast of New Orleans because of the way they felt he ran that city during the war after it was captured by the Union. Most of that, if you really read, was, I don't know if sour grapes is the right word, but he was not a beast, he was a hard man, and he was a tough man, but everything that I've seen says that he was a fair man. But General Blanche Butler was considered one of the most beautiful, accomplished, and popular belles of Washington. General Butler lived in Lowell in the house to the right. And I don't know if that house is still there.
Yeah.
Is it still there?
No?
No?
Burned down about 20 years ago.
Oh, did it really?
Is that the one up on School Street?
No, it's not Belvedere Hill.
Oh, okay.
4 hours for this Washington.
His wife, Sarah, Benjamin Butler's wife, Sarah, was actually an accomplished Shakespearean actress at the time. And Ames grew very quickly to admire Butler's courage and his honesty, and I don't know how much of that was a young man that was interested in an older man's daughter, but they met early in 1870 in Washington because at the time General Butler was a congressman from Massachusetts. And on July 21st of that year, after about a 6-month courtship, they were married in buy a home in 1872, and they went to live there with their baby son Butler, who was born on the 22nd of August, 1871, 13 months after they were married. Their daughter Edith was born on the 4th of March, 1873. Ames spent his Senate career mostly in attempts to get federal help for, under the 14th Amendment, which gave citizens the rights to life, liberty, and property, except unless given due process, because the Ku Klux Klan were making severe attacks against the blacks in Mississippi. And current Governor James Adelbert, this gentleman right here, who had before the war been one of the largest landowners and slaveholders in Mississippi, but a reluctant secessionist in the war, was not doing enough to stop it, in Ames's view. Alcorn had removed many of the officials that Ames had installed as provisional governor, and Alcorn actually left the governorship and took the other U.S. Senate seat along with Ames in 1871. And at that time, Ames wrote to Blanche, "The warfare he began on carpetbaggers when he became governor is raging more fiercely today than ever. And now comes the question, shall he whip me or I him in Washington?" For the first time in his life, Ames voted in an election in 1872 in the state election in Mississippi. And his faction of Republicans won the state legislature over Alcorn's faction of Democrats and what were called scalawags, which were the Southern people that sympathized with the Republican Party. They weren't very well regarded by the rest of the Southern Democrats either. In 1873, Ames and Alcorn actually faced each other in the governor's election. And Ames won that election by a vote of about 70,000 to 50,000. And he took the governorship as an elected official rather than an appointed one in January of 1874. That is the governor's mansion in Jackson, Mississippi. Blanche was a reluctant first lady. She spent most of her time in Lowell rather than in Mississippi, continuing as she had before. She called the governor's mansion, which actually looks like a fairly nice house, a great barn of a house, and complained that she had to tell the cook that lard was not the staff of life. And in fact, because of the problems that she faced when she was out in public, and the attitude that people had toward her and her children because of the fact that they were considered carpetbaggers and because she was Benjamin Butler's daughter, she actually didn't let her children off the grounds of the mansion while they were there. Ames did his best to be a fiscally responsible and frugal governor, and he actually did a pretty good job. His state expenses when he was either provisional governor back in the late 1860s or elected governor were significantly less than the period in between those two jobs. He also wanted to achieve equal status for the black citizens of Mississippi. That he didn't have quite as good success with. There were continued troubles with the Klan, and opposition to his policies made Ames quite tired of the governorship even within a few months of his inauguration, and made him to be a somewhat weak and indecisive governor because his heart just wasn't in the job. But he resolved to stay on for the 4-year term and to buckle on my armor that I might better fight the battle of the poor and oppressed colored man, who was regarded by the old slaveholder only as an inferior and not fit for the duties of citizenship. The Democratic Party, which at the time was mostly made up of the former Confederates and had a great membership in the Klan, discovered that terror was an effective tool to keep blacks from voting in state elections. And mob rule actually became quite the way of life in many cities in Mississippi in the mid-1870s. so the state legislature immediately began writing up trumped-up articles of impeachment to get rid of Governor Ames. None of the articles of impeachment, and there were 21 in all, actually mentioned anything about personal corruption or personal misdeeds, either by him or by his government officials. They were mostly things about just the fact that he left the state so often because his family was enrolled, or that he had pardoned the wrong kind of criminals, or that he had appointed the wrong kind of judges. Blanche actually suggested that he resign from the governorship rather than go through the impeachment hearings and the trial in the state legislature, because she felt that his honor, his integrity would not, that he wouldn't win, that he'd be thrown out of office, and that he wouldn't recover from that. And he agreed, and he made that offer to the state legislature, and they agreed. And so Governor Ames resigned the governorship on the 28th of March, 1876, and left the state of Mississippi, and actually left public office at the age of 40, and never returned to the state of Mississippi again. And once he left, the Democrats published in the newspapers all of the articles of impeachment that they had promised that they would drop if he resigned. So while they didn't follow through with the impeachment, they did publicize what they felt were the problems. Ames's parents had actually left the clipper ship business and moved to Minnesota, to Northfield, Minnesota, with their son John T. in the 1860s to start a flour mill business. And Ames actually, instead of going back to Lowell to be with his family, left Mississippi and went immediately to Minnesota to start working with his parents and his brother. On the 7th of September, 1876, the Jesse James gang came to the city of Northfield to rob the Northfield National Bank of a large deposit that they thought Jesse Ames had just made from the flour mill. And the town of Northfield had been tipped off. They were waiting for the James gang and actually shot them up pretty good. And some of them got away, but 3 or 4 of them were killed in the town of Northfield by the citizens. It's possible that Ames was there. There's nothing in the many letters that he wrote, so it's unlikely. But from different things that I saw, it was possible that he was in the city at the time. While he was in Northfield working for his parents, he was a tinkerer. He was an inventor. He actually received several patents for different mechanical devices that he invented to make the mill process more efficient. This is the Ames Mill, which is now, if anybody has seen the malto meal cereals that they sell at Market Basket that come in a bag, they're not boxed up. This is actually the malto meal cereal plant right now. It's still open 140 years after it was built. While Ames worked in Northfield, he spent most of his time, he spent summers with Blanche and his family, both in Lowell and in their family estate of Cape Ann around the Gloucester area. And they wrote each other constantly when they were apart. I'll touch on that later. They got together long enough, just, while they were together, they always found time to get another child in the mix. And their daughter, Blanche, was born on the 18th of February, 1878. In July of that year, Ames went to New York City to start a commission business selling the flour from the mill. And General Butler actually helped with the financing of that business and the mill. At one point, he had a 3/4 ownership in the mill. And Ames moved his family to New York City in September of 1879. Son Adelbert Jr. was born on the 19th of August, 1880, and daughter Jessie, their 6th and last child, was born on November 2nd, 1882. In 1886, the mill ran into some trouble due to a general economic depression in the country, some over-speculation in wheat, and some financial mismanagement. It went into receivership, and some of the creditors actually sued Ames and General Butler for their personal real estate. But Ames and Butler won that litigation. Because of what came out of it, they had to close the commission business, and Ames moved the family to the Highlands of Monmouth County in New Jersey in 1887. His father died on December 6, 1894, and the mill transferred ownership to his brother, John T. And he still had an interest in it as well, but he was not a working partner anymore. He got involved in many different investments in the 1890s. He got involved in a consumption and tuberculosis sanatorium in New Mexico in the mid-1890s, land speculation projects in New Mexico and Virginia, textile mills in Lowell, and lots of real estate. And in the end, he basically made a fortune from the different investments. So that by this time, he had that very stately look about him, a very rich man around the turn of the century. Ames and Blanche were both strong believers in education for both their sons and their daughters, which was not a commonplace occurrence at the time. The children were all homeschooled until they were old enough to go to preparatory schools, and then they all went on to college. Butler, the oldest son, went to Phillips Andover and then to West Point in his father's footsteps. Adelbert Jr., Butler went to Phillips Exeter in West Point. Adelbert Jr. went to Phillips Andover, Harvard, and Harvard Law, and the girls all went either to Bryn Mawr or to Smith. A lot of Ames's time at this point in his life was spent defending his administration in Mississippi. There were books written that said that he had incurred debts of $20 million during his time, when in fact he had only incurred a state debt of $500,000. And he wrote a letter to the author of the book that stated that, saying, "You've been extremely unfortunate in the selection of your authorities. They have led you into making a $19,500,000 mistake in a $20 million statement." And a long series of letters went between Ames and that author before the author finally acknowledged the error and corrected it in later editions. In 1898, after the explosion of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor, the United States declared war on Spain in April of 1898. And at the age of 62, General Ames volunteered for service to President McKinley and was appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers, commanding the 5th Army Corps. A very large party was held in Lowell at the Butler House before he shipped out, and his son Adelbert actually went with him and served on his staff. Ames was sent to Cuba and commanded brigades on San Juan Hill in the middle with the Rough Riders and around the city of Santiago. He wrote to Blanche, "The difference of dates of my two commissions as Brigadier General by Lincoln and McKinley is just 35 years. Yet when I reached the trenches on San Juan Hill and found myself among soldiers and heard the bullets and shells, that period of more than a third of a century was obliterated and I was again a youth." Santiago surrendered on the 16th of July, 1898, and Ames' Corps was soon sent back home, and he actually at that point became very critical of the Army and the way that they had handled its sick and wounded during the war. Because of the tropical temperature, there were yellow fever problems and malaria problems that actually killed more soldiers than the war itself. Ames led his men in a peace parade and army review in Philadelphia in October of 1898, brought them to camp in Charleston, South Carolina, and found that the conditions of his treatment in the South were much better at this point than they had been 25 years before. He was honorably discharged as a almost 63-year-old Brigadier General in January of 1899. And after his discharge, on many occasions, he was invited to speak about and write about comparisons between his service in the Civil and Spanish-American Wars. In later life, he spent most of his time traveling. He went with Blanche to California, to the French Riviera, to Italy, and in the early 1900s, we finally get Tewksbury into the mix after about 38 minutes. He basically sat down one day and he bought Ames Hill, which at that time was Prospect Hill. He owned 700 acres of land on the hill. I have the plans of his estate over here if people want to look at it later, but he pretty much owned estate with fieldstone walls, and throughout the building, every floor in the building is made out of reinforced concrete. It's on the highest point in Tewksbury. Some say it's the highest point in Middlesex County, but I'm not sure if that's true. That's one of those things you can tell me I'm wrong about later. From the top of Ames Hill, they could see Boston to the south, Mount Wachusett to the west, and of course Lowell. And in fact, Ames bought a lot of the homesteads that already existed along Kendall Road for his children to live in. And I'll talk about them in a few minutes. He actually used his connections within the Army and the Army Corps of Engineers to build Ames Pond. Ames Pond is a man-made pond at the base of Ames Hill and a dam on the hill. It was actually the first project that the Corps of Engineers used steam shovels to create. Now we're going to get into some pictures from 1950 of, this is the front of the castle. This is the rear of the castle. I have a feeling that clothesline was never used by Blanche Butler Ames. Doesn't seem like, from everything I've seen, to be her cup of tea. I have a feeling she had people doing that. And then this is the carriage house off behind the building. The building is now currently privately owned. And this is the dam. This picture is actually taken in 1910. Maybe a little tough to see. There's a little waterfall in the middle that comes down through it. So he was a stately old gentleman as he got into his 70s and 80s. His interests through the 1910s and 20s were genealogy, going back, looking up his family and making records. There's actually a fairly extensive genealogy. There's a copy of it in the Lowell Public Library. He was a member of many military societies, the West Point graduates, the Spanish-American War veterans, and the Legion of Honor, which is a society of Medal of Honor winners. And his primary passion, besides his family at this point, was golf. He took up golf, and this man golfed just about everywhere in the world. He golfed a lot in this area at Vesper Country Club and at Long Meadow Country Club in Tewksbury and Lowell. Courses in Rome and Italy, at Myopia Hunt Club and Essex County Golf Club in Massachusetts, Algonquin in New York, and many different courses down in his second home where he wintered in Ormond Beach, Florida. We have a couple of pictures of him on the links with some buddies of his. And his best buddy that he met down in Ormond Beach was John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller actually visited Ames in Tewksbury at least on one occasion. But they wintered there, and until he was 95 years old, he had regular golf outings with Mr. Rockefeller. They used to stay in the Ormond Beach Hotel, and Blanche got a little tired of staying in a hotel room while he went out golfing. So she basically went out and bought just about every house that was available in Ormond Beach, Florida. The first one was called The Wynn, but it turned out to not be a Wynn because she bought about 8 different houses for both their use and their children's use during the winter. The last house that they lived in, which they called Stone House, is now the Ormond Beach City Attorney's Office, and the grounds around it are now Ames Park in Ormond Beach, a city park. I actually have also to look at some newsletters of the Ormond Beach Historical Trust that talk a little bit more detail of Blanche's buying spree, and her daughter Blanche and her husband also spent a lot of time in Ormond Beach. So we have a picture, and when I saw this in the book first, I was wondering why Charlie Chaplin was in the General Ames biography, because it does look like that. But this is General Ames at the age of 97, doing his daily walks, which he did in wherever he was, whether he was in Tewksbury, Lowell, or Florida. He basically spent his 80s and 90s watching his children do very impressive things, telling second term of Andrew Jackson died in the first term of Franklin Roosevelt, and saw a lot of things and was cognizant of all of them right up until the point that he died at 97. The official cause of death was given as septicemia, which is blood poisoning as a result of an infection of the foot, and senile exhaustion, which the more I've been doing this thing for 6 months, and I've started to get a little bit of senile exhaustion as well. So he was, at the time of his death, he was the last surviving Civil War general, and when he died, he was also the oldest surviving West Point graduate. They had a private funeral at the castle, and he was buried in Hildreth Cemetery, which is right off on Hildreth Street in Lowell, off Bridge Street, a private family cemetery. Blanche, actually, she was 12 years younger than Ames, but she spent the remaining years of her life compiling those hundreds and hundreds of letters that they had sent back and forth when they were separated during his public service years. And that became a 2-volume book called Chronicles from the 19th Century, which covers the years 1861 through 1899. Her daughter Jessie edited them for publication in 1957, and there is a copy of those in the Lowell Public Library as well. At the historical exhibition at Tewksbury's 200th anniversary in 1934, Blanche loaned an oil painting of Ames that they had had in the castle to the exhibition. And in Ye Town book, the description of the exhibition at that time, Ames was described as a man of splendid personality and sterling character, which I think could be anybody's goal. I think certainly is mine. Blanche died on December 27th, 1939, at the age of 92. Her daughter Edith lived at the Fitzgerald homestead on Kendall Road. She made a large financial contribution to the 200th anniversary celebration. She was, of all the children, the most involved in local Tewksbury type of things. The other children either left the area or became involved in more nationally oriented things. And when the Tewksbury football stadium was dedicated in 1938, Edith Ames, who was the wife of Brooks Stevens, donated the flag, the first flag that flew over the stadium in honor of her father. She died on December 6th, 1958, at the age of 85. Jessie, their last daughter, died on February 9th, 1967, at the age of 84. She and her husband Andrew Marshall lived at the Kendall homestead on Kendall Road. And their great-grandson was George Plimpton, the author, who just died last year. She was Blanche, their daughter Blanche's grandson. He was rather. Butler Ames, their oldest son, he was a colonel in the Spanish-American War and later a major general in World War I, and a 5-term congressman from the Massachusetts 5th Congressional District. And he was very interested in travel as well. This house is on Italy's Lake Como. It's called Villa Albianella. And he purchased that and renovated it. And that's actually what got his father over there to play golf on the golf courses of Italy. Butler Ames donated land. He actually lived on the Clark homestead on North Street, which was right at the gate of what's now Catamount Road, going into the estate, going into the castle. And then he lived in the castle until he died on November 6, 1954, at the age of 83. In the early 50s, he donated land in the hill for use for 2 500,000-gallon underground reservoirs that Tewksbury used for its water supply. His son Adelbert, and now you're saying, but he served in World War I. His name is on the memorial tablet in the town hall in Tewksbury. He started a career as a lawyer and then became a noted ophthalmologist, and he started the Dartmouth College Eye Institute. And he built what is now called an Ames room, and it's those rooms that you see in same corner of the room, but because of the trapezoidal structure of the room, one child looks a lot bigger than the other, because that child is actually a lot closer than the other one. And it was a concept that had been devised in the 1870s, but he was the first that actually put it into practice to show how it affected vision and optical illusions and things like that as part of his work in ophthalmology. He died on July 3rd, 1955 at the age of 74. Blanche Ames. Here's where it gets confusing, because her name was Ames, but she married a man named Oakes Ames, who obviously was no relation. And he was a botanist at Harvard University, and they built an estate down in the lower end, which is called Borderland. It's in Easton, Massachusetts. It's now a very large state park built around the estate, 1,500 acres, I think. And he had all kinds of botanical gardens around the estate that you can visit now. She was a leader in the women's suffrage movement. She was an accomplished artist. She actually painted the official portrait of General Ames that sits in the Hall of Fame in the state capitol in Mississippi. She painted that. And she was a leader in the women's suffrage movement. She was a leader for birth control rights in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And late in life, actually in the early 1960s, after the book Profiles as Courage came out by John F. Kennedy, in which John F. Kennedy wrote, "No state suffered more from carpetbag rule than Mississippi under the governorship of Adelbert Ames." She, at that point, was in her 80s, I think. And she went off and she wrote a book. And she spent a good part of the rest of her life putting together the single real biography that exists of her father. And, this is it here. So she didn't spare the work. And it was really a defense of her father's integrity, which she felt that then Senator Kennedy had really impugned. And he did say that he was wrong, but he never did correct it. And it's still in the book. And it still says it, and it probably shouldn't, but I don't think he can change it. Blanche Ames died, the last of his children to die, on March 2nd, 1969, at the age of 91. Just to let you know that I didn't make it all up. The primary source, which really is the only real biography that exists, is the large book that his daughter wrote, and the letters that Blanche and Adelbert shared. There is another book called Three Carpetbag Governors, which does have a very good defense of Ames's administration as one of the essays in that book. There's another book about the 20th Maine Regiment by John Pullen, which there's a copy of that in the Tewksbury Library. We have copies of the first Adelbert Ames book up in the local history room as well. And then the two town histories that have come out, both Patton's book and the book that was out for the 200th anniversary celebration. There were articles about them that I have up here if anybody wants to take a look at. And I want to thank a couple of people. Mike Kelley bought the Adelbert Ames book, found it in an auction somewhere for $12. I think he paid for it last year. It's a first edition. It's signed by the author. It's probably worth God knows what, because they only printed 250 of them. But he was kind enough and the society itself was kind enough to let me take it and spend a lot of time poring through it and scanning things from it over the last 6 months. So I have to thank Mike for that. Dave Marcus gave me these 3 pictures of the Ames Castle that I have in. Gordon Kipp is actually the president of the Historical Society in Ormond Beach, Florida. And just this week, they sent me up these newsletters that if people want to take a look at about the houses that they purchased down there. And Steve York in the town crier, who did a really nice write-up of this, and hopefully that's what brought some people out today. They did a really good job last week of writing this up, so I think the society is grateful for that.
used to say that he was a resident of Tewksbury and Lowell, because every time that he went to get his horse out of the carriage house, he had to go to Tewksbury.
Oh, really? Yeah, I mean, everything I saw said that it was long.
The house was in Lowell.
Yeah.
Tewksbury annexed, Lowland is part of Tewksbury and about the road, 1912. I think he was. One thing you mentioned in John Kennedy's book,
He was an ash.
Profiles of Courage, where he was critical of General Ames, I agree, Kennedy was wrong in that. But one of the things Kennedy was trying to do was build up Senator Ross from Kansas, who was the deciding vote against Andrew Johnson in impeachment.
Right,
Andrew
well,
Johnson, the prosecuting attorney for the House, was Ben Butler, so I think he was extending this to the vote.
right, and he, I mean, in that paragraph that he wrote about Ames, he talks about Butler as well.
Butler
I
was the
mean,
chief
in
prosecutor.
that essay, in Profiles of Courage, that particular essay was about Senator Lamar, the gentleman who had led that revolution in Mississippi in 1875, and he was defending, in Senator Lamar's profile of courage was that after Senator Sumner, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, had died, Senator Lamar, as a way of trying to make peace between North and South, got up in the U.S. Senate and did a very long and poignant eulogy of Senator Sumner, who, and those two were as far apart as you could get, but at that point they were just trying to make some peace in the mid-1870s, so he threw in a little dig there at Ames to try to build up what Lamar had done in Mississippi before him. Oh, well, no, congratulate Louise. Because I would have been up here saying Adelbert for an hour if she hadn't told me last year that it was Adelbert.
Did you say after Reconstruction he did not believe in Negro suffrage or did believe?
During the war, after the war, when he was in Europe, he wrote to his parents that he thought that was too much to go for at that time, that it should be a more gradual process, and that the radical Republicans at the time were going for an all or nothing, and he, I think, feared that it might get the war almost started up again, because they wanted so much. And I think he wanted to ease more into it. And, maybe at the time just didn't have while people in Maine, and in this part of the country hated slavery, I still don't think they had equality in mind as the end goal. I mean, I don't think, that they quite thought of blacks as equals even at that point.
This is the current owner of the castle, so.
Maybe Dave Marcus could ask the Sullivan family if they're going to donate the estate to the Historical Society.
Took the words right out of my own mouth.
I think the tax is better than
Yes.
I had a curious question whether the information I have is correct or not. But for my parents, they tell me that my great-grandparents had purchased the Butler Ames estate right at on Main Street and Railroad Crossing. They always call it the Butler Ames
don't feel comfortable with public speaking, but you want to work in collaboration with another person, we're more than happy to